Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Indian Express Group, a very warm welcome to the Indian Express Think series on reimagining schools. Today's theme is the NEP 2020, India's Foundation for Becoming a Knowledge-Based Economy, presented by Central Square Foundation. IE Thinc is a thought-provoking forum that brings together thought leaders, policymakers, and corporate leaders to encourage a substantive exchange of ideas and get the best minds to give it direction and solutions. This edition of IE Thinc will discuss the direction school education has to take to achieve NEP's vision and the role that technology can play in enabling this change, besides unpacking the impact that this might have on the future economy. We are delighted to have with us as our chief guest and keynote speaker, Shri Dharmendra Pradhan, Minister of Education and Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, Government of India. Thank you, sir.
Namaskar, my greetings to all of you. I am pleased to share my thoughts on National Education Policy 2020 at this forum organized by the Indian Express Group and Central Square Foundation. Friends, the world has been transforming at a faster pace than ever before. We are at the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution, which is set to create new economic and social landscape. We need to aspire for a deeper and more expansive knowledge-based economy to effectively confront the challenges that we face today. COVID-19 has emphasized the power of convenience of digital technologies as well as its limitations. It has expedited processes that were already underway that we need to quickly adapt, learn and relearn. I am thankful to our education institutions and especially teachers across the country who have transformed their mode of delivery and rapidly adapt to this unprecedented situation. It was neither easy for them nor the students, but they rose to the occasion, ensured that the pandemic does not prevent students from learning. The NEP 2020 has been introduced after a gap of more than 3 decades to transform our entire educational system as per the competency and skill required for a knowledge-based economy of the 21st century. NEP 2020 based on the principle of affordability, equity, access, quality and accountability, while aspirational also recognize the immediate challenges in the education sector. That is why it has put utmost focus on foundational learning. Our government has launched Nipun Bharat mission to ensure that every child in the country necessarily attains foundational literacy and numeracy by the end of grade 3 by 26-27. Friends, our school education as we have been during the pandemic will need more than conventional school space for the children to learn. The NEP 2020 has highlighted the need of the hybrid and innovative modes
Good evening, everyone. My apologies for the slight delay. We had a bit of a technical glitch. Let me begin by welcoming all of you once again on behalf of the Indian Express Group. A very warm welcome to all of you to the Indian Express Think series on reimagining schools. Today's theme is the NEP 2020, India's Foundation for Becoming a Knowledge-Based Economy, presented by Central Square Foundation. IE Thinc is a thought-provoking forum that brings together thought leaders, policymakers, and corporate leaders to encourage a substantive exchange of ideas and get the best minds to give it direction and solutions. This edition of IE Thinc will discuss the direction school education has to take to achieve NEP's vision and the role that technology can play in enabling this change, besides unpacking the impact that this might have on the future economy. We are delighted to have with us as our chief guest and keynote speaker, Shri Dharmendra Pradhan, Minister of Education and Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, Government of India. Thank you, sir, for making the time to join us here today. I'd also like to welcome our esteemed panelists, Asiya Kazmi, Global Education Policy Lead, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Dr. Dheer Jhingran, Founder, Director of Language and Learning Foundation, Madhav Chavan, co-founder Pratham, Merlia Shaukat, founder and CEO, Madhi Foundation, and our partners and participants. The session will be moderated by Ritika Chopra, National Education Editor, The Indian Express. And if you have any questions to the panel, please share them in the Zoom chat box. We will try to answer as many as we can. I will now invite the Honorable Minister to deliver the keynote address.
Namaskar, my greetings to all of you. I am pleased to share my thoughts on National Education Policy 2020 at this forum organized by the Indian Express Group and Central Square Foundation. Friends, the world has been transforming at a faster pace than ever before. We are at the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution, which is set to create new economic and social landscape. We need to aspire for a deeper and more expansive knowledge-based economy to effectively confront the challenges that we face today. COVID-19 has emphasized the power of convenience of digital technologies as well as its limitations. It has expedited processes that were already underway that we need to quickly adapt, learn and relearn. I am thankful to our education institutions and especially teachers across the country who have transferred their mode of delivery and rapidly adapt to this unprecedented situation. It was neither easy for them nor the students, but they rose to the occasion, ensured that the pandemic does not prevent students from learning. The NEP 2020 has been introduced after a gap of more than 3 decades to transform our entire educational system as per the competency and skill required for a knowledge-based economy of the 21st century. NEP 2020 based on the principle of affordability, equity, access, quality and accountability, while aspirational also recognize the immediate challenges in the education sector. That is why it has put utmost focus on foundational learning. Our government has launched Nipun Bharat mission to ensure that every child in the country necessarily attains foundational literacy and numeracy by the end of grade 3 by 26-27. Friends, our school education as we have been during the pandemic will need more than conventional school space for the children to learn. The NEP 2020 has highlighted the need of the hybrid and innovative modes of learning. Our government has launched the PM E-Vidya. It includes the digital content platform Diksha for one nation, one digital platform, the Swayam Prabha for one class, one channel. As Honorable Prime Minister said, this is not the government education policy but the country's education policy. It will be successful with Sabka Prayas. The government, private and civil society organizations all need to work together to achieve the goals of NEP. The role of media is also important, especially for awareness among the parents and the community to increase their involvement in students' learning. The media must also highlight the innovative models that our teachers are using at the grassroots level. Community participation is one of the major focus of our government. As our Honorable Prime Minister made development a Jana Andolan, the national education policy will be successful if all the initiative, be it Nipun Bharat, PM Poshan or Vidyanjali, became mass movement. As we have come together to fight COVID-19, we must work together to ensure that our children get the best education and skill necessary for the 21st century. We will move with our Honorable Prime Minister's motto of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas or Sabka Prayas to achieve the vision of national education policy and become a major vibrant knowledge economy. With this, I convey my best wishes to organizer and the participant of this event. Thank you, friends. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your thoughts with us. Ritika, now I'll hand this over to you.
Thank you, Pooja. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to IE Thinc. As my colleague Pooja mentioned, this is an express event where we get some of the best minds to discuss some of the most pressing concerns of today. Today's event is about the new national education policy. And I know a lot of us have already attended a lot of these events and sessions where we've practically discussed the NEP, its content and its aims to death. But we are here today to discuss the changed circumstances in which this policy is now being implemented. As we know, the National Education Policy is a document that envisions the reframing of education for the 21st century. It focuses on career readiness, which requires communication, critical thinking, problem solving. And while it's one thing to introduce a reform plan, it's just another to put into action. As we know, the policy document was drafted before the pandemic struck, and the pandemic, fortunately, unfortunately, has changed the context, the circumstances in which this policy is being implemented. And we're here today to kind of discuss how should the implementation of the new education policy be contextualized in the post-COVID world, and how should school education adapt to the current context to help achieve the aims of the new education policy. These are some of the questions that our panelists today will tackle. Before I start the discussion, I just want to quickly tell you a little more about our panelists here today. We have with us Dr. Madhav Chavan. He's the co-founder of the Pratham Education Foundation, which has been bringing out the ASER report quite regularly. In fact, Pratham's work is often associated with mainstreaming learning outcomes, the conversation about learning outcomes in education governance. He's been recognized for his work with the Wise Prize and the Skoll Award. Thank you, Dr. Chavan, for making time. We have also with us Mr. Dheer Chingran. He's the founder, director of the Language and Learning Foundation. This is a social enterprise that works on foundational learning. It has a pointed focus on mother tongue-based teaching. Mr. Jingran, we're really looking forward to his interventions because he's a former IS officer. He will hopefully provide us an insider's view of what are the challenges of implementing education reform. He's worked both within and now working outside the government. We have with us Marlia Shaukat. She's the CEO of Madhi Foundation. It's a fairly young NGO, which is again working on foundational literacy. It almost, I think, was deliberate on our part to have so many of our panelists here who work in this sector, also because the new education policy has this thrust on foundational literacy and numeracy. Madhi Foundation is currently actively working with the Tamil Nadu government in trying to implement its mission of helping kids in government schools to attain reading and mathematics skills appropriate to the level, I think up to the age of 8. And finally, we have Asya Kazmi. She is the Global Education Policy Lead at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Asya has a 25-year career in education, but she started out as a mathematics teacher. Again, Asya, we hope, I guess, given that how critical the teaching community is in implementing any educational reform, again, looking forward to your interventions and inputs today. So I think we should start right away with the discussion. But even before I get into how we should maybe try and tweak the implementation plan, how should we contextualize the implementation of NEP, I would start with a common question to each of our for each of our panelists here. And this is something I have often wondered about, that given the disruption that the education system has witnessed across the world in the past 18 months, what should we prioritize? Even before we get into implementing deep education reforms, should we pause, take a breather, and just focus on recovery and catching up? Or should we sort of fire ahead with the reforms that have been proposed by the new national education policy? And this is a question for all the panelists. Dr. Chavan, would you like to go first? Dr. Chavan, you'll have to unmute yourself, please.
There is no question that recovery is of primary importance. Without that recovery, you can't build on top of whatever we have today. And it's in shambles. But when we plan the recovery, we have to decide what is it that we are looking for. What is that recovery? Because that recovery will mean different at different levels. For children in the first grade, for example, first standard, they're going to something called a school for the first time ever in their lives. But if you're looking at 9th graders and 10th graders, then they are concerned about the 10th standard examination or the 12th standard examination and what's going to happen next. So one fact is that they have not been to school, they've not worked on the various curricular aspects that they're supposed to. But at the same time, they are concerned about the examinations. And so it's not recovery per se, but actually assuring them that they are going to be able to handle the problem of education or examination properly, that the system is going to handle it. Before the schools reopened, there was this question: are the exams going to be held? Will the exams be held on time? Will there be exams at all? How will we know who's better than who's somebody else? What about my school, college admission? Because there is one big segment, and this is the point I'll probably make throughout the discussion today. There is a segment of people with parents of higher income, parents of higher education, who are concerned about the higher education side of things. And they know that they want to go to higher education, they want to find jobs, salaried jobs, permanent jobs, or whatever you call them. But there's a very large percentage of population for which this education system has really done nothing. Well, nothing, almost nothing. Nearly 70–80% of the population finds that spending time in school is waste, because at the end of it, they're not going to get those kinds of jobs. These salaried jobs, the population that gets salaried jobs in India is barely 9%. What about the rest of the population? The curriculum that we are talking about is, first of all, it's not good enough to get jobs in the current economy, and there are not enough jobs. So these kids are going to get out of school and they have to start looking for their livelihood somehow, daily wages, and so they have nothing to go by. And with this problem of schools shutting down for such a long period of time, they are in a double whammy. The others have something to go by, but this population, which otherwise would not have anyway gotten jobs or prepared themselves for jobs, are going to have a lot of trouble. So their recovery, where they are going to head, is going to require a special kind of consideration. So at different levels, age levels, and also different learning levels, or even economic levels, we'll have to start thinking about how we are going to handle the recovery. Maybe others will have something else to say about it.
Marlia, would you like to come in?
Sure, thank you, Ritika. I think the way the NEP envisions deep education reforms has the potential to sort of shock the system and upset the equilibrium, right? And at a time where the system is already reeling under the shock of COVID-19, I think there needs to be a balance between a radical and a conservative approach, just like how Madhav sir just said, to recovery and reform. So there are different components and aspects of education that probably lend themselves to a drastic paradigm shift from the status, and others for whom the treatment may need to be much slower and incremental. Right. For example, in a post-COVID world, it does not make sense to sort of go back to business as usual with textbooks that are rigidly grade specific, given that children are not going to be at grade level when they come back, right? And they weren't even before COVID hit. So now may be the best time to sort of undertake a curricular reform that takes into the reality of the post-COVID context and aims to make learning more sort of learning level specific rather than grade specific, which would be, I would think, a very drastic reform for a system that's very used to a sort of a standardized approach. There are other aspects of the system reform that the NEP recommends, like setting up accountability structures, rewards, penalties for teachers for non-performance, etc., which would certainly shock the system in the short term and requires an immense amount of, as you can imagine, political will. And one might argue that those aspects may not be an immediate priority while we're still preoccupied with recovery and supporting both children and teachers to return to schools. I think around the world, some of the most powerful reforms, deep reforms that have been undertaken in the light of COVID has been the purposeful inclusion of community as stakeholders in children's learning and schooling trajectories. And I think that we suddenly saw the onus of learning and teaching shifting from schools and teachers to homes and parents, especially for younger grades. And I think while this comes with its own pitfalls, this particular aspect of the education demand supply spectrum needs more deliberate and meaningful action, and states must start looking at deep reforms in these the demand side on improving the quality of demand of education as well. So I do think that our public systems are shy about placing such power in the hands of the public and the community, but we forget that systems exist for children and community and not the other way around.
Sorry. Asya, I would like to tweak the question a little bit for you, given your experience, sort of I think you could give us an international perspective of this, that do you think that the COVID crisis so far has drastically changed the trajectory of educational reforms in countries elsewhere? I mean, what do you see?
Thank you very much. So I think, first of all, the pandemic really amplified the centrality of schools to our social systems, our communities, and not just as an education aspect. In the Gates Foundation, we're a very small team and we're focused on foundational literacy and numeracy. So I'm going to take a focus, I'm going to take that perspective and what has the pandemic meant for that. But essentially, coming back to being a teacher and thinking about education at whatever level you're at, it to me is three things. First of all, where are your students at right now? So, which is, assessment, formative assessment, citizen assessment, whatever. Second aspect is, where do you want your students to be? What's the curriculum goal, the national curriculum, the lesson plan, the learning objective? And then the third aspect is, how do you get them there? And COVID has amplified that. So learning losses have really made countries think about the loss because children forget and the loss of the missing learning. How do we bridge that? And while there'd been focus on this aspect previously, what the pandemic has meant is that there's a real objective understanding that in some cases there's been 6 months missing, 12 months missing, or 18 months of schools missing. How do we go back to a system that allows that recovery to take place? But before recovery can take place, you have to understand what was lost. So how do we assess, not in a way that is high stakes, but in a way to say, where are our students now, so that we can help them to recover? And this has sort of formulated thinking in how do we speed up that recovery. So whether you're a grade 3 student who perhaps hasn't been to school in grade 1 or grade 2, or you're at the secondary education level where you've had some learning, but clearly what will be missing. And the kind of approaches that countries are taking fit into 3 brackets, and perhaps a combination of those 3 brackets. The first one being increasing the focus on what should be learned. What are the non-negotiables that children need to know to be able to access whatever grade they're in? So if they're going into grade 3 and they do not know how to read and write and do basic maths, your textbook and your grade level curriculum is irrelevant. You're not teaching the textbook, you're teaching the child. If you are like a secondary maths teacher that I was, there is no point me teaching algebraic fractions if the children don't know what standard fractions are and if they don't know what numeracy aspects are. So increasing the focus by saying what are the key objectives that children must know to be able to progress within the school. The second time within the school curriculum. The second aspect is increasing the time for the instruction. So if normally you might have had 30 minutes or 60 minutes of literacy instruction, there is now, and here can talk much more about this, we've been looking at the model they're proposing, is how do we condense or focus the curriculum, increase the time for those key objectives to be learned. And then thirdly, about increasing the quality of instruction. We know in low middle income countries that 53% of the children globally were not acquiring the basics. In low income countries, that was about 90%. So how do you increase the quality of instruction that allows that catch up to take place? And the most impactful interventions will be the ones that combine those 3. Increasing the focus on a few objectives, increasing the time for those objectives to be mastered by the students, and making sure teachers are supported and equipped to do that. My final point would be that there is an emotional aspect to what's happened. There's an emotional aspect for children, and there's an emotional aspect for teachers. And if we don't have the right frame of mind and right support for teachers, then all the technical solutions cannot be taken up.
Right. Mr. Jingran, would you want to come in here? Do we hit pause? Do we fire ahead with the reforms?
Right. So my view here is this, that I don't subscribe to the dichotomy between recovery and reforms. Because recovery, if we look at mitigating the learning losses of the pandemic, actually require a 2 or 3 year academic plan for bridging, and where key skills and competencies of previous grades have to be taught. And this kind of work cannot be done unless there are certain reforms. That's the point Marlia and Asya as well were making. For example, I'll list out a few, unpacking a few points that Asya made. A review of the curriculum to identify key learning outcomes. What should children learn? What's core? Reduction in the content, and reducing the curricular content, the breadth versus depth argument which the NEP takes. Because time is limited, children have lost a lot of time. Focus on foundational skills, again, drawing from the NEP. Regular formative assessment so that teachers know where children are and which children are falling behind. What should be the focus of teaching given where children are at that point in time? Frequent revision, scope for practice by children, and some remedial work ongoing for struggling learners, not periodically, but regularly. More inclusive classroom practices, Asya mentioned, the socio-emotional aspects, which are very crucial to learning. Children are self-confident, they understand, they can engage with tasks, that's very useful. including children's familiar and home languages for comprehension, and then partnering with parents as enablers for learning. Now, all this is something that the recovery requires. Recovery is not 2 months of remedial teaching and that's done. And this is as good a time as any to try and introduce some of these reforms. Now, I don't know whether they are deep reforms, whether they're things that that can be done. They're not easy to do, but not addressing reforms to say we are focused on recovery is not going to help, because recovery requires these significant reforms, and this is a good time to sort of reimagine as schools reopen, are already reopening, using a structured pedagogy, formative assessments, moving away from rote memorization, socio-emotional learning. Each of these is reforms. So my argument here is this, that certain aspects that the NEP highlights of the reform, I know there are too many there, it's too wide and aspirational, but certain aspects are very relevant for the recovery that's to happen now in the next few years. And therefore, I would not subscribe to saying it's recovery versus reform. I'll actually frame it more as what essential reforms are required to ensure that help mitigate the learning losses and change what's happening in the classroom. That's the need of the hour. Thank you.
Madhav, do you agree with the Thief here that there is no dichotomy here? It's not recovery versus reforms at this point?
No, there's no question that there is no dichotomy. The point is, how much time do we have? And if you start, so the one thing that NEP has done is it has started thinking in terms of goals and timelines. It's unfortunate that they pushed the deadline for achievement of literacy and numeracy for third standard children to 26-27 instead of the 5 years that they thought about. But you have to do certain things in a short period of time. What the pandemic has done is it's shaken confidence of a lot of people, especially young children, teachers, and so on. How do you bring it back? If you keep waiting for, once you say that I'm going to go in for reforms, then everybody starts saying, "Ye reform hone do." Once the reform is done, then everything will be in order. That's true. I'm not saying no. You go for the reform first, and then you will have the changes. Or should you say, look, I'm going to achieve something that I've lost? That's why the learning losses and what children have lost, what children have forgotten, where children need to leap to. For example, if you've lost a year and a half, you were in the 9th standard to begin with, and now you have to appear for your 10th standard exam suddenly, then how are you going to catch up? What is that catch-up mechanism going to be? And that itself is a different way of thinking. So we will need to do that. The deep reform part is certainly necessary. That is why I was saying that if you look at different ages and stages, so what you will do for 1st to 3rd grade could be a deep reform thing, which a lot of people have been doing anyways. But what you want to do for 9th and 10th standard may not be deep reforms. You may have to do something, a very bad word, but quick fix. How will you do it? That because these kids are going to get older in 2 years' time, and they'll have to go to something else, and they don't have time. Their parents don't have time, and so I think for different grades we'll have to think differently. And you can't say for higher education I'm going to wait for the deep reforms, but for the 1st and 2nd and 3rd you can do deep reforms. There's no question about that. So I think that the whole system has to think. The other thing that we are missing out here, and this is a big opportunity that to think, whether call it deep reforms or whatever, is that in this entire pandemic, parents have played a big role. Forcibly, they had to teach their children, they had to look after their children, they had to take care of their children. The whole meaning of education, the word education, I believe, means bringing up. So actually, we've gone back to where it actually belonged. And so, how are parents going to teach children? Community participation and all that are the big words. But my child and teaching my child is my responsibility. In fact, I'd like to think every parent a teacher. How is that possible? Because we had not thought about this before, but we were forced to think of it. So how can we do this? How is this possible? This reform NEP doesn't think about. Okay, so so there are things that this pandemic has brought out which need to be thought through. So I think strategy, there's no one strategy for all, clearly, but you can apply your mind and work out different strategies at different grades, different levels, in different people.
Right. Asiya, if I can ask you a broader question connected to this, what according to you are the basic principles that we know that underpin successful education reform, in the sense that things that would work broadly in any context, if you can sort of list that out for us?
It's an interesting question, particularly given I work in the UK context and then shifted to the international development context. And often you'll hear context matters. I think, of course, context matters. Context matters in a district, whether it's in London or in Delhi, and context matters at a global level. But there are principles. Next month, RTI will be publishing a Learning at Scale report, which identified 8 programs that have successfully shifted the needle on learning outcomes, and 2 of them are in India, so I was just looking out for that. But the common principles are having a very clear goal of what you want to achieve. What is the system aiming towards? Is that goal understood by everyone, from the classroom teacher, the parent, all the way up to district, national and international? So that clarity of goal, we are trying to raise learning outcomes by grade 3, and this is what grade 3 students should be able to do, for example. Having a real focus on improving the quality of teaching. And there are a lot of things within that sentence that needs to be unpacked. We know things like training teachers at the start of the year isn't as effective as coaching them and supporting them on an ongoing basis. So the way I capture it is not the sage on the stage, but the guide by their side, and teachers learning from each other and learning together. So that focus on quality of teaching. And that governance model, but that's more about a supportive framework that allows teachers to take on new practices, to learn together, to have an understanding that what teachers do is demanding, and asking them to do more needs some support to be able to do so. So the conversation that the district leads have, or the teacher coaches have with them, and that quality of support that's practical, is really important. The other aspect is, what is that accountability framework, and who is accountable to who? And here we're looking at really having good quality data that is supporting improvement. It's not saying you're not doing this, go do this. It is saying, what do we need to do to those who are not perhaps advancing or improving learning as much as possible? What extra support do they need, and how do we get that to them? And here I think this statement, which Dhira referenced earlier about formative assessment, and Malia did as well, it's about assessment-informed instruction. So using data to actually take action, whether it's in the classroom level, school level, state or district level. The other aspect, and it's shifting from the accountability culture to a responsibility culture. That we are responsible for these children we're teaching, that there is a goal that needs to be met. What do I need to do to help them meet them? I think tech has a role to play, and we'll come back to this later, but it is understanding the realities of what teachers are doing and ensuring that the support provided to them allows those innovations, and by innovations like small I with this, innovations to take place in the classroom. So whether it's supporting them with lesson plans, structured pedagogy, that there is alignment between what the curriculum says, what you're assessing, and the support you're providing for teachers to take that on forward. So in summary, very clear goals, support to teachers on an ongoing basis, and the use of data to say, are we on track, and how do we course correct if we're not?
Right. I do want to we are kind of running out of time, but I do want to touch upon the issue of implementation and whether that needs to be contextualized at all in current circumstances, and want to focus on foundational literacy and numeracy. And my question to you, to Marlia, the new policy kind of focuses on a very personalized, differentiated experience, kind of advocates moving away from this one size fits all approach. In these changed circumstances, when the learning environment has changed so radically, and when resources of schools, have been stretched to their limits, how, for instance, do you think that we can try and strengthen the foundational literacy and numeracy in these times? And how do you think that can be done? And whether, the government's already launched the Nipun Bharat scheme, but one aspect of that scheme, for instance, is focusing on experiential learning, toy-based learning. We're not sure how much of that would be practical maybe now or for the next 1 or 2 years. So if you could give us a sense of, for instance, if we had to strengthen FLN, how could we do that in the current circumstances?
So the way personalized differentiated approach has been envisioned in the NEP is quite resource intensive, right? And it requires investment both in technological capital and human capital, because it is quite, it requires a lot from the teacher to be able to personalize and differentiate support. And as you rightly pointed out, where do we go looking for resources to support what is, an extremely well-intentioned policy? But I do think that in the short term, one can leverage existing systems and resources to infuse as much personalization and differentiation as possible using data and technology. For example, teacher training can be differentiated if you're able to collect relevant data points around, subject mastery, post-training, delivery of instruction, student performance, and you triangulate, you understand what kind of support the teacher requires, and provide a more personalized sort of support rather than a one-size-fits-all. Everyone congregates at a training center and receives the same kind of training that we're all sort of used to. Teaching or facilitation in a classroom can also be differentiated if teachers are trained to evaluate students in a meaningful way and sort of group them based on the focus they require. In India, 80% of our classrooms, more or less 80% of our government school classrooms are multi-grade, especially in the in the FLN context for grades 1, 2, and 3. So it is imperative, almost, it is required to have a more personalized approach, because you will have children in grade 3 who are still at a grade 1 level, and so on and so forth. So certainly, a one-size-fits-all doesn't work, particularly in the FLN context. And the other examples I could think of without too much incremental investment is, if you were to build lesson plan repositories that teachers can access based on what teacher believes would be the most contextual and personalized way to teach a particular topic. So while technology-driven personalization, where you set up adaptive learning solutions in classrooms, is great, and there are many effective models, it's also very, very resource intense and expensive when you think of the scale at which you would need to implement this. Again, I think this has to be a deliberate decision on the part of the system and the education leadership to sort of step outside the comfort zone of standardization and invest in whatever resource or capacity building that is feasible at this point to at least start moving in the direction of personalization and individualization, even if it is not possible to replace the current system entirely in the short term.
Theer, the same question, but I would like you to, for instance, the same question with regard to foundation literacy and numeracy, but as we witnessed in the last 1 year, education otherwise has been notoriously slow to adopt innovation. But what has happened because of the pandemic is that all the innovations which were sort of in the margins have now been pushed right to the center of education systems across the world. Your experience and in your organization's experience, are there any strategies that hold promise in terms of strengthening education, children's education, or particularly maybe in the context of FLN, that you would want to talk about? Anything that helps achieve the NEP's aims better, any kind of innovations that you may have noticed which really hold out promise?
Sorry, can you hear me now? There was some
Yes.
problem with my connection.
Yes, you're audible now.
Okay, so I missed a part of your question, but I did get the gist about innovations that have come up in the last 1 year, and what would you then want me to address? I apologize.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on any of the innovations that you think hold promise in terms of strengthening education, or maybe in terms of improving foundational literacy and numeracy.
Right. Sure. So I think there have been innovations, but many of them are also in the nature of quick fixes. So they're not, there are some which we know have just been done because there was a very difficult situation. But I'd like to talk about two of them. And the first is how we've managed to ensure that there is the greatest attention to children who are at the bottom of the pyramid. So what, if I have to talk about the experience of our organization, it has been possible for us to identify, the teachers and the volunteers. There was actually a small group community teaching program in several states, and we contributed to that, to look at those children who are the most vulnerable, those who are at the bottom of the pyramid, and then help them by not individualized plans for every child. But as Murlia was stating, it's more about identifying a group of children who've fallen behind, who've not been regular, and then doing something extra for them. This could be in the form of materials, workbooks, additional practice. And that seems to have worked because these kids showed actually the highest learning gains in the program that we did with the state government. So I think we would like to take that, continue that in school as well. And a huge focus on children who are not doing well. And we know that these disparities have exacerbated after the pandemic. So that's a very important part of the work that should happen, and it's been tried out. The second, of course, as Madhav mentioned, and the NEP is definitely weak on that, is about encouraging parents to play a role in their children's learning. And that's been a big revelation for all kinds of parents. Many parents cannot give time. And it is true that it should not be factored in after schools reopen as something that will be available to every child. So we should not get overly dependent on parental support and say, this is what is going to happen. But it is something that, at least parents were giving some time, making a child sit down and work on whatever workbook was provided, maybe not being able to explain too much. And I think that is an innovation, or that is it shouldn't be called an innovation. That is something which should have been happening, but more of that should happen where the school and the parents are linked, and there is some activities that children can do at home. They need not be always activities that are for literacy and numeracy, but could be activities where they find out more from their mothers and fathers and come back to school with something else. But just ensuring that there is a component of the home that is brought into school, and there is greater linkage between home and school. So I'd say these are two things that were revealed to us quite strongly, and we would like this to be something that we'll definitely continue with whichever schools and state governments we're working with.
Right. So Asya, I believe, has a prior commitment, and she will have to leave in about 5 minutes. But Asya, before you go, I would like you to address one issue. One is that, we're talking about innovations that were witnessed at this time. But any decisions that are implemented in education are usually grounded in sort of research-backed evidence. While we acknowledge that, some of the innovations which we possibly even be discussing after you leave are just emerging, and there is more to learn about how they work. But would it be wise to maybe scale up some of these innovations, given that we may not have enough research to back their effectiveness? But do you think that this opportunity could be leveraged to kind of scale up innovations in education, given that education, like I mentioned earlier, has been notoriously slow to adopt innovation?
Like two things. One thing is how I teach a class of mine on Monday morning is different to how I teach them on Friday afternoon when they're tired. So innovations, having replication is something that needs to be carefully considered. There's certainly principles that apply, but those principles need to be contextualized. It needs to be contextualized for the class and for the teacher and for the wider context. But the good thing, particularly looking at foundational literacy, is we know what works. We know that this structured pedagogy, explicit instruction, which is not chalk and talk and boring, it is engaging, etc. And that breaking down of phonics teaching are things that have proven to improve rapidly. We know from things like Pradhan's work on TAL, LLF's work on sort of lesson guides for teachers, providing support and lesson guides and coaching works. So, and there's great examples within India about what has improved learning outcomes. The focus is now innovating for implementation. How do we do it at scale, and how do we do it for those who are most underserved? You talked about those children who are falling behind or have poverty as a factor, maybe gender, etc. How are we constantly saying, what does implementation look like for them, and how are we tweaking that implementation? I think the literacy side, we have more examples of what works. Numeracy side, we need to develop more of those examples of what are those strong principles for improving rapidly the mathematics learning of children. And again, we have examples of bringing in the real life experience of mathematics and connecting formal and informal mathematics. There's also the role of technology in innovation, but technology alone is unlikely to be the solution. So how technology is integrated with good quality pedagogy and using teachers to be doing the research, applied research, I think is a really important aspect of how reform needs to happen. So, we have examples of what works. We need to be much more rigorous on implementing, understanding what implementation at scale looks like. And I think this key question that will guide us in our reforms is this very simple one about who isn't learning and what are we doing about helping them to learn? And if we're regularly asking that question at all levels of the system, we're much more likely to shift. And if that's an innovation, and in some systems that is an innovation of just asking who isn't learning, why aren't they learning, and what are we doing about it, that will help to make a move. And my final point before I leave to say is I think it's exciting to see the commitment to foundational literacy and numeracy within NEP. It's supported by additional funding. So the political will is there. It becomes important on us, all of us, from teachers, parents, all the way to funders, as well as implementers, is how do we take and utilize that headwind to really transform learning for particularly the most underserved.
Right. Thank you, Asya. And thank you so much for sparing time for this session. Unfortunately, Asya would have to leave at this moment, but thank you again for making time.
Thank you very much. And it was a privilege to be on this panel.
Right.
I'm sorry I can't stay.
So Asya did touch upon this, the topic of education technology and its effectiveness. And Madhav, I remember watching, this was quite some time back, watching a talk possibly, I don't remember where and when, but you were talking about education technology. And I did sense some bit of skepticism in your tone. This was, I think, easily about 6-7 years ago, about how helpful educational technology could be in quote unquote in the current inefficient system, where you mentioned that edtech is linear and our current learning environment is non-linear. So you're not
The other way
sure.
around.
Sorry?
The other way around.
Sorry. Okay. My mistake. EdTech is non-linear and the current learning environment is linear. And you're not sure how well that would work. But now, given that, there has been this massive disruption in education is forced to adapt to technology, has your view changed about education technology and how well it could be leveraged to maybe even implement the NEP or improve learning outcomes?
No, in fact, it's reinforced, because what has happened is we have taken the technology. The point is, we're taking the technology and trying to teach the same things the same way. So you are making technology subservient to the curriculum, the syllabus, and the teaching methodology, the pedagogy. Okay, so it's not as though the technology is, fundamentally, if the technology is to be used, like you remember very well, it's a non-linear process. So whether I should learn something now and then something later is, suppose if I don't want to learn sciences now, but I want to learn only English, is there a problem with that? According to our old ways of doing things, there is a problem. And according to new ways, it may not be a problem. See, we are recently, while this pandemic was happening, we were trying to give young people lessons in basic digital literacy. Okay, and by that we meant how to use mobile and social media and so on and so forth. What we discovered was that a very large proportion of young people already know it. They know how to work Facebook. They know how to use Workplace. They know. They may have to know a little bit here and there, much more in application terms, but they've learned many things. See, the technology has pervaded the society so much, and young people are learning it. They may not learn what you want in computer technology, but they're learning many things. The question is, to allow them to leapfrog, what are you going to do? Are you going to give them first mathematics and then grammar and all that? Or are you going to allow them to leapfrog? I think it's a very important question. Are you using education technology to teach the same things, same subjects that you were teaching before, the same way? Or are you going to give kids technology in their hands and say, do what you want? Of course, we would want them to learn the sciences and the math and the English and all that. But how is the question? When you say one shoe doesn't fit all or whatever, one size doesn't fit all, it actually has to mean many more things. It has to mean many more things. So I don't think we have merely taken the technology and used it, but we have not changed the way we think in terms of the technology. We are just simply taking the technology and using it. So that is one. And the other one is, so that is the first part. And the second part is examination and assessment. Our attitudes to those have not changed yet. That will require some reform. And if we do that quickly, I know quickly is a bad term, but if we do it now, the way people think will have to change. And everything is now directed by examinations and assessments, not assessments, examinations.
How do you think this attitude change can come about? It would be gradual, but what are your thoughts on that?
It may not be gradually. It will cause some destruction. But if you change examples, for example, if I tell you, so let's ask employers when they employ anybody come walking in through the door, what do they ask them? Do they look for communication? Do they look for common sense? What do they look for? And then if you say, okay, all you students, I am going to start opening examination centers. You come and appear for examinations which are only about communication. and I give you certificates. And then let the employers take them, interview them and say, okay, I like this guy. I met a researcher who had worked for MIT at one point, and he had carried out a research with employers saying that, do you actually look at certificates and do you give importance to degrees? And his conclusion was that most employers do not respect uh, certificates or marks or whatever of the kind. Those are completely useless, redundant pieces of paper. And this is the reality, and we are not changing to that. So how it will change come about is if employers, even if they're 9% jobs, if these employers start looking and asking different things instead of asking for degree certificates and diploma certificates, attitudes may change. Already they are changing, because you know your 10th standard certificate is not worth it because you have the Aadhaar card to show what your birth date is now. The 10th standard certificate means nothing. Tell me one employer who considers it of any importance. Only to get admission in 11th standard, nothing more than that. So I think this is a case of the emperor with no clothes. We know that this is a useless system. It doesn't take us anywhere, and still we persist and we want to reform it.
Thir, your thoughts on leveraging EdTech for implementing the vision of the new national education policy?
If it is going to, sorry. I'm sorry.
Go
I didn't realize you were asking Dhir. Go ahead, Dhir. Sorry.
No, you want to come in? Madhav?
No,
I'm
go
sure
ahead.
you can come in.
There's always much more to talk about. Dhir, go ahead, please.
Right.
Okay. So I'm a little biased towards foundational learning. That's the area we work in. What we have used extensively technology in the past couple of years, more than what we did before, is for continuous teacher professional development. And we found that to be very useful. As long as we use a blended model, so there is online work, but there is face-to-face interaction also, because especially for foundational learning, a lot of the issues are related to beliefs and attitudes, whether all children can learn, when do you get children to write, is thinking possible or not. So blended courses with a digital component, with lots of resources that can be shared on WhatsApp and other social media regularly with teachers, and of course interspersed with reflection and peer meetings. So a very blended model with a lot of scope for technology to be used is what has been tried out, and it seems to work. A pure online mode of training, which we've done extensively last year, we found that it isn't moving the needle as far as teachers understanding or conviction is concerned. So that's definitely one. I agree with Madhav completely that if we reproduce what happens in a classroom through technology, that's not useful. And I go from state to state and see smart classrooms, and some of them have good videos or PowerPoints, and there's someone lecturing. So that's not useful. That can be improved definitely for, let's say, English, math, science. But what's surprising is that as soon as you move out of that physical smart class, in the next class, teaching and learning continues as if there's no difference at all. Even if there were good things that were happening in the smart classroom, and children were given a scope to do some hands-on work, in the regular classroom, it's the same chalk and talk, and the teacher does most of the talking. So I think technology must be leveraged to see how the equations in a classroom can be changed, and children get to interact. They're actively engaged, and that is something which should affect the teaching learning elsewhere also, in the whole school. So that's very important. And of course, as was mentioned, I think by Maria, that and Madhav as well, that assessments, classroom observations, getting quick results from dipstick surveys, getting people to visit classrooms and then understanding what they found there, quickly coming up with what are the big priorities and issues, and then doing something on that basis, are definitely very useful. I have been enamored with low-tech options, because especially looking at what the country can do in the next 5 years. Again, I'm sure we should be aspirational, but we're trying to do low-tech options in terms of good videos that can be shown, technology that can be used for monitoring personnel. So we should decide what we are ready for. And for young children, we don't have great digital content, and young children should not actually have to just look at a screen. There's so much research to say that young children learn the best when they talk, they interact, they talk to their peers. So, the use of technology for children should be fairly carefully done with young children.
Marlia, the constant refrain or the reference that we keep hearing when we talk about EdTech is, the term digital divide and how education technology may have exacerbated the opportunity gaps. But EdTech is here to stay, even after the post-COVID world. So, according to you, in the specific context of foundational literacy and numeracy, how do you think education technology can be used to effectively cater to the multiple learning needs of children from underprivileged backgrounds? Because we constantly hear that how, because of EdTech and because of technology in education, that this section of the student community has been left behind. Do you think EdTech could be used effectively to cater to their needs specifically? And if yes, then how?
I think both Dheer and Madhav sir have spoken about this already, saying that, one is that for very young children, you have to be extremely careful about how EdTech is deployed, because learning for very young children, children that we speak in the context of FLN, EdTech can be an enabler, but not a replacement to what really works, right? So I'm actually going to speak not necessarily about FLN from or EdTech for FLN from a child's perspective, but actually from the adults in the system that can accelerate the FLN outcomes, right? So COVID has certainly accelerated the pace of adoption of technology for both children and adults, and I think it's almost easier for children to adapt to tech than it is for adults. And in this case, we saw the teachers who earlier shied away from any kind of technology and were daunted by it were quite effortlessly embracing it in their daily life. And I think we must leverage this momentum. But like it has been pointed out, you cannot use EdTech to sort of perpetuate the same flawed system. Right. And I think especially for reform of large public education systems, the way NEP envisages it, any tech-based solution must be holistic and cohesive and be built for every stakeholder, the teacher, the student, the administration, and the parents, and not limited to the narrow definition of EdTech, the way we've come to define EdTech today, right? Which is either test prep or just one-way content consumption. It shouldn't be that, a few dozen apps now replace a few dozen registers or a few dozen textbooks, right? And that it does nothing to make the system more efficient, or that it doesn't really win the system's confidence. The technology can make life easy for whoever it is being built for, and life, learning more exciting for who it is being built for. And while on one hand there was an almost immediate adoption and openness to adopt technology, what we also saw, of course, was the manifestation of the digital divide in many ways, and too many of our children simply got left out of the online learning ambit. And I think we cannot turn a blind eye to that. If NEP is about educational equity and inclusion, which indeed it is, we must make an honest attempt at solving for the access to technology, access to the technology problem at scale for our children. While there's been a lot of acknowledgement of the digital divide issue, I don't think we've pushed ourselves hard enough to think of solutions for access to technology yet. And I think discourses must be had if technology is here to stay.
Right. We are running behind time. I have one last question, and we'll quickly take a few questions from the audience. Another question is for you. COVID has changed the way we live and work. There are many people in traditional jobs like teachers and lawyers, they've been forced to kind of pick up new skills. Do you think that, what is it that should the NEP be tailored in some way to meet the demands and expectations of a new post-COVID economy?
I don't think I understood that question.
Do you think that although the policy is out there now, the document is there, but do you think we need to tweak the implementation anyway? Because what we see is that there are many people in the working class who've been forced to pick up new skills because of the current circumstances. Is there anything that this policy document should have had or should have maybe going forward to cater to the demands of a post-COVID economy?
Who are you asking?
Madhav, you. Or anybody else for that matter who wants to take this.
Somebody take the first shot.
It's not my area of experience.
No, so
understanding.
look, people are forced to, when it comes to economy and work, people are forced to change and adapt to the technology that is available, that they need to use. So people are using phones for payments, they're using phones for ordering and all kinds of things people are doing. It should be easy to get that kind of training if training is required at all. I don't think training is required. That is why these things are very, very popular. Okay. So it should be easy enough for people to learn these new techniques in the economy. That is not such a difficult part. As I said, our experience was that young people and social media, people use social media so quickly. In fact, there was a funny incident when we started working with tablets in villages. We gave out some 3,000 tablets in villages. And my colleague said, let's put a password so that the kids will not be able to download stuff and things, be mischievous about it. And so I said, okay, that's fine. But what we found was within 15 days, half the passwords were broken. And we didn't teach anybody. The kids just, they learned from somebody. And this was divided into 3 states, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, and Maharashtra. Nobody told them, but they learned. So this learning is such a powerful thing. The demand to want to learn, the motivation to want to learn is so great that kids can actually learn. And the problem with our education, and this is where I will stop, is that we are shoving things down their throat without their motivation to learn it. We create the motivation saying, ye karoge to acha hoga, job milega, ye hoga, wo hoga. But that is not where the demand is. That is not where the motivation lies. So where there is motivation, I think this is much quicker.
We'll take a few questions from the audience. Can Sunil Moore please ask his question? And can you please tell us who the question is directed at? Is Sunil there? All right, I think we'll move on to the next person, Lakshmi Kanta. Can you ask your question, please?
Problems of education technology.
Yeah, please ask.
Yeah, yes, you are.
Good evening, panelists. Nice discussion. Thanks a lot for your inputs. In fact, apart from academic transactions for learners, are schools supposed to develop some mechanism in collaboration with different boards like CBSE, ICSE, or state board to have training for parents, enabling them to assist their words in learning? Because as such, online transactions are going on. Should there be some mechanism? Sir, would you like to please throw light on it?
Who is this question meant for?
Sir, to the entire panelist it is meant. Anybody can.
Would any one of you all like to take that question?
I can, if that's okay.
Sure, of course. Go ahead.
And again, I think my bias remains with respect to FLN, and so I will speak in that context. I do think that we need to demystify learning for parents, and truly, even if we work primarily with parents who are semi-literate, non-literate, or literate, there are ways in which parents can support children with setting up certain routines at home, and very, very simple techniques that they can use to support children at home, and this may not require very intense training as such, but some sort of sensitization to what parents can do to provide a conducive learning environment at home, especially in difficult homes that most of our children come from, is possibly the need of the hour, and to help parents de-jargonize learning for parents. I mean, you give them a report card today and you expect them to understand merely from the mark sheet as to what skills the child has or has not mastered. And that, I think, we can sort of demystify, and the onus will be on the education system to build that communication channel with the parents, be open to transparency with the parents about children's learning, and co-opt them in the process. So this may not necessarily require very intense training. And I keep going back to what happened during the pandemic, which is that most of the pressures of teaching children were on the women, on the mothers, right? And that may not be entirely fair, because you do not know the kind of circumstances that women have to grapple with at home, in addition to everything that they take on themselves. So I do think that some sort of sensitization is necessary, but we need to be mindful of the pressures that it might place on parents, especially women, if learning is taken home to a great extent.
Right. Thank you, my dear. Shalini Sahai, can you please ask your question and mention who it's meant for?
Shalini, please unmute yourself.
Hello, good evening all. Yeah. My question is also on a similar, is FLN is also, we talk of lot of community driven initiatives. So is FLN also community driven? And if yes, is there any promising practice that you can help me understand? That is point one. Point two, how will SMC and parents be engaged in the process of monitoring their child's thing when it's homeschooling? Do you really feel SMC will be empowered to do that? Any of the panelists?
Okay, I'll just attempt one part of it, and I'll supplement what Murlia said. I think demystifying learning and getting parents to understand what children are supposed to learn is very important. But even before that, the school is so distant from parents, especially if you get to remote areas, tribal areas. It's a formidable space where parents do not even don't even go, and the teacher has always maintained, the school has maintained a distance from parents, as if what happens within the school is something that that's a responsibility of the teacher, and after that he or she has got nothing to do with what happens at home. So I think first, an understanding, and this is still an issue of what we believe, what can happen, attitudes as well, that learning continues beyond the classroom, and the parents and the environment of the child can contribute to that. Parents can access the school, talk to teachers about their children's education, go to the school, frequently, and try and understand how their children are doing. So I think the distance between the school and parents has to be reduced, and I think COVID has provided us that opportunity. Teachers have been in touch with parents either because the government's asked them to do, or that was the only way in trying to understand what children were doing. So building on that to reduce this divide between the school and the parents can be really the first step. And then, of course, talking to children about parents about their learning and report cards, etc. The SMCs, unfortunately, are at different levels of functionality or dysfunctionality across the country. And there have been several attempts at training SMCs and getting them to understand what they should do. I have greater faith in parents as an institution and parent-teacher meetings and associations and parents interacting with teachers than the mechanism of school management committees, because the teacher tends to dominate in those forums at the SMCs. So I think if we could get parents and teachers together and bridge that gap, that would be good.
Surcha Gogoi, can you ask your question, please?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. This is Surya from Assam. It has been wonderful listening to this discussion. My question for the panelists is mainly focused on the issues of using mother tongue and home language at the school level, as that has been outlined in the NEP as well. How important will this be moving forward to ensure that children acquire foundation skills? Also, what should be done to ensure that teachers are ready to take this up in the classroom? And my question is for Dr. Bhejingran sir. Yes.
It's a very wide scope of the question. But one thing that enough research and evidence around the world has shown that unless you can use a language that children comprehend, or anyone, even for us, if you do not use a language that children can comprehend well, or we can comprehend well, learning cannot take place. That's the bottom line. And what the NEP says is make children's languages the mediums of instruction. Now, which languages? There are so many languages, there's so many variants of languages. So we have to look for pragmatic solutions. Again, sorry for again using the word pragmatic, but it is not possible to use all languages as mediums of instruction. But ensuring that children's strong languages come into the classroom, they're used formally for comprehension, even if they're used initially more in the oral domain, so that there is complete comprehension happening in the early grades. Because in FLN, that's a time where children haven't had exposure to other languages. So it's even more crucial to depend on the languages that children know and understand and use well. So FLN success really depends on inclusion of children's languages. But what I'm trying to say is, there is no one model in saying that we will introduce all these languages as mediums of instruction, make textbooks and those. There are other strategies that can be used to ensure that those languages find place and are used. And as I keep saying, this is really an issue of, again, beliefs and attitudes, of an awareness that, there is multilingualism, and languages and its variants can come into the classroom. They will not take away from learning the state language, Hindi or English. They will only enhance the children's ability to learn more and better. So at some level, I think it's a more awareness generation first about the fact that several languages can come into the classroom and they don't detract from learning.
I'm afraid that's all the time that we have for questions. I would like to invite Shweta Sharma Kukreja. She's the co-managing director of Central Square Foundation to give the concluding remarks. Shweta.
Thank you for helping moderate this very interesting and engaging discussion. And thank you to our panelists who are all friends, mentors, and partners in our shared mission for early learning, for keeping it very open, discussing many critical issues. I think it is very heartening to see that now, while after almost 3.5 decades, we have a new education policy. It's very learning focused, it's very outcomes focused, and there's a lot of honest discussion on the need to make sure learning is measured, learning is reported, and the necessary actions are taken to ensure that it's a additive journey, a forward-going journey. Very heartening to see the focus on early learning convert into a national mission for early learning, Nipun. I think all panelists here have been working towards early learning even prior to the mission. The mission gives a great opportunity for us to bring all that effort together in collaboration with the government, with the system. Education in India has always struggled with the fact that all our children are not learning. Our kids are getting promoted to further classes without them being at grade level. And COVID meant that we had to come up with a lot of innovative solutions, which weren't always very strategically or thought through in a very integrated manner. But with the NEP, with the early learning mission, and learnings from how we've had to give almost a first line response to COVID, it gives us an opportunity to say, how do we now integrate all these best practices towards a system solution for early learning? And I think all panelists have spoken about whether it's the technology divide or whether it's the reality of parents can't really become the educators. We have to engage with them as the enablers of education. How do we integrate a solution which captures the role of teachers and system functionaries, the appropriate teaching learning material, whether it's an assessment design or a print-rich material which helps focus on orality, along with relevant solutions for parents, community, and technology.